Okay, in the face! Oh my god! Do another one.
Before the public ever heard a single official timeline, the strongest red flags were already in place. A man caught on camera at Ben Hill who insisted he was never there. Another privately claiming he'd seen Summer's dead body, before retracting it as a dream. A father declaring she would never be found. And multiple early witnesses dying in sequence before their statements could be examined. These are not loose rumors, they are documented contradictions that fracture the foundation of the case. If this is the real starting point, what was removed before investigators ever arrived? The most consequential anomaly in the early case data involves the presence of Andy Bernard on Ben Hill Road during the critical window of Summer Wells' disappearance. The detail is not ambiguous. A neighbor's surveillance camera recorded Andy's vehicle and movement in the area at a time when law enforcement was attempting to reconstruct who was present on the road, who was leaving, and who had proximity to the Wells property. Despite the existence of visual confirmation, Andy initially told police he had not been on Ben Hill Road at all. A direct contradiction between a physical piece of evidence and a verbal denial establishes the foundation for a high-value investigative discrepancy. When a subject lies about physical presence, the core question becomes the motive behind avoiding that admission. Fred Hill, a local resident who interacted with multiple officers within the first 72 hours, added another layer to this discrepancy. According to Fred, Andy was not merely present, but was observed leaving the hollow alongside a blue pickup truck. The detail is consistent across multiple recounts by Fred and appears in context separate from public speculation. A dual vehicle departure, especially during the time frame when search operations were just beginning, introduces the possibility of coordinated movement between two individuals or two vehicles. The existence of a second vehicle also aligns with the broader pattern of early case clues pointing to road-based transport, including the K9 trail terminating abruptly at the street. The most serious statement associated with Andy does not come from Fred but from Jody Sue's daughter, who reported that Andy told her he had seen Summer's dead body. When questioned later, Andy allegedly reframed the statement as dream. The shift from a declarative assertion of direct visual knowledge to a symbolic, non-literal dream suggests an attempt to retract an incriminating implication without fully denying the original phrasing. In forensic linguistics, a retreat from a direct statement into a metaphor is frequently categorized as post-exposure minimization, especially when the earlier phrasing was not elicited under pressure but arose in casual conversation. Within 2 to 3 days after Summer was reported missing, Andy quit his job and left the area. Abrupt employment termination and geographic displacement, shortly after a critical incident, are patterns commonly flagged as avoidance behavior. The timing is material. Most residents remained engaged with search efforts, media presence, or community discussions. A rapid withdrawal from routine life, particularly without a documented external cause, raises questions regarding whether the change in behavior is linked to knowledge of the incident, fear of exposure, or an attempt to sever ties with individuals who could place him at the scene. Hunter's interview with Chris McDonough introduced another data point, the alleged "it's done" text message sent to Candace on the day of the disappearance. While the content is unverified, and the sender cannot be confirmed without digital forensic access, the timing overlaps with the same cluster of individuals. If the message originated from someone connected to Andy, or the environment Andy was interacting with that day, it would form a communication anomaly inside the same temporal boundary as the camera footage, the blue pickup sighting, and the alleged statement about seeing Summer. The surrounding cluster of individuals linked to Andy via the hollow also exhibits significant instability after the disappearance. Multiple figures: Doug Gott, John Smith, Roy Cotton died in the months following the event. Although cause of death for each individual is not established as suspicious, The statistical rarity of multiple associated individuals dying before they can be re-interviewed, especially in a rural region with a small population, is a notable pattern. Roy Cotton's final remarks add another weight-bearing detail. He allegedly said, "When they find Summer, they will know who did it." The phrasing reflects perceived insider knowledge rather than generalized community speculation. If Cotton possessed relevant information, and if his death occurred before a comprehensive interview, then potential testimony or corroborating details may have been permanently lost. These interconnected elements create material investigative gaps requiring systematic examination. First, the question of why Andy denied being on Ben Hill Road despite camera evidence remains unresolved. A false denial typically signals either fear of implication, involvement in unrelated illicit activity, or an attempt to prevent investigators from exploring associations that existed during the time period. Without an alternative explanation, the denial functions as an intentional attempt to obscure presence. Second, the role of the blue pickup truck following Andy is unexplained. If the second vehicle was associated with him, it introduces a two-vehicle system capable of executing a short-range transfer. If it was independent, then a coincidence of tightly timed movement still requires evaluation. In both scenarios, the blue pickup becomes a variable with potential relevance to movement, concealment, or handoff. Third, the presence of George Bernard, Andy's father, on Ben Hill Road on June 15 despite not residing in the area for approximately 20 years introduces an additional anomaly. The timing appearing on the day of the disappearance and his reported behavior, asking what people knew, suggest situational awareness inconsistent with a long-absent resident. His proximity reinforces the possibility that multiple members of the same family or network had overlapping situational knowledge not represented in the official timeline. Fourth, Andy's departure from Tennessee within days of the disappearance fits the behavioral template for information avoidant withdrawal, particularly when paired with a known false statement to law enforcement. Geographic distancing immediately after being placed at the scene by visual evidence has investigative value, even if not proof of direct involvement. When these points are evaluated together, they form a cohesive cluster rather than isolated anomalies. Each data point may be insufficient alone, but combined, they establish a pattern of presence, evasion, contradictory statements, synchronized movement, and destabilized witness availability. The cluster directly intersects with the possibility of a handoff event, a witness transfer, or a localized disposal operation involving multiple actors. Given the density of contradictions, evasive behaviors, and corroborated presence, this cluster must be classified as Suspect Class A within an analytical framework. It holds the highest concentration of unresolved leads, unaligned statements, and behavioral red flags derived from the 10-file dataset. Do the overlapping movements and statements of Andy Bernard and his associated network represent coincidence, or the outline of an unacknowledged transfer event? The behavioral and linguistic anomalies associated with Don Wells form one of the densest contradiction clusters in the entire Summer Wells case file. Across interviews, live streams, and statements collected over several years, Don repeatedly produces language that suggests prior knowledge, fixed certainty, or internalized conclusions about Summer's fate that are not supported by verified evidence. These statements, collectively categorized as slippage, carry investigative value because they reveal unconscious framing rather than deliberate public messaging. Slippage, in forensic linguistics and behavioral analysis, typically emerges when a speaker attempts to manage perception while simultaneously suppressing information that conflicts with the public narrative. In Don's case, this conflict manifests through absolute statements, misplaced certainty, scenario-specific references, and contradictory reconstructions of the day Summer disappeared. One of the most frequently cited statements is Don's declaration that she will never be found. This is not merely pessimism, it is categorical finality. Innocent parents of missing children often express difficulty, despair, or fear, but rarely produce language that frames the child's status as definitively unrecoverable. The phrase eliminates every investigative pathway: rescue, abduction, return, accidental discovery, or future evidence recovery. The certainty embedded in this statement creates a linguistic anomaly. Absolute predictions imply either knowledge or belief that the outcome is fixed and unchangeable. Without physical evidence supporting such a conclusion, the statement becomes inherently suspect. A second slippage appears in, "I'll see her in the resurrection." This is not a metaphorical coping sentence. It is a direct theological framing that presupposes Summer's death. Dawn does not speak conditionally. If she's gone. If something happened. He speaks with doctrinal finality, the implication that Summer is deceased at a time when law enforcement was still searching suggests again a cognitive shift away from uncertainty and toward internal acceptance of a specific outcome. It also contradicts the innocence model of parental reaction, which typically centers on active searching, public appeals, or conditional hope. Instead, Dawn consistently moves into post-mortem framing. The psychological discrepancy between uncertainty and acceptance provides investigative weight. Why is Dawn so certain of death when neither body nor cause has been confirmed? Another notable slippage involves Dawn's earlier belief that Summer might get run over. This predictive fear is highly specific. Parents often worry about generic risk: strangers, wildlife, accidents, but Dawn names a precise mechanism of harm. The relevance becomes more significant when combined with Candace's drunken statement captured in another file. "I regret letting Summer play near that truck." When two independent individuals within the same household produce statements associated with vehicle-related harm, investigative attention shifts toward examining the physical environment, vehicles present on the property, and the plausibility of an accidental death scenario followed by concealment. The pairing of these two statements suggests shared cognitive leakage or a shared event memory not expressed openly. Two additional slips intensify concerns. "I took her back," and "we weren't 30 feet away when she got gone." Neither phrase logically fits the context of Dawn's official account. Dawn maintains he was at work on the day Summer disappeared, which removes him from the physical environment. Yet the phrase, "I took her back," positions him as an active participant in a moment involving Summer. The sentence structure resembles a reflexive leakage rather than an intentional claim. Meanwhile, "we weren't 30 feet away when she got gone," places Dawn within close proximity to the event. This contradicts the official narrative and conflicts with Candace's version of events, which centers the disappearance inside the basement, not outside in the yard. The shift between inside disappearance and outside disappearance marks a major contradiction. If Dawn were reconstructing only what he had been told, there would be no reason for him to choose a spatial frame that contradicts Candace's description. These slippages converge with contradictions in Dawn's timeline. Multiple tree trimmers reported that Dawn was at home the morning of June 15, around the time he claims to have been at work. They describe seeing him at the Wells property between approximately 8:30 and 9:30 a.m. Dawn denies this. If the tree trimmers' observations are accurate, Dawn's presence at the house earlier than disclosed significantly alters the movement map of the day and undermines the credibility of his entire timeline. A false alibi is a high-value investigative signal, especially when supported by multiple witnesses. Behaviorally, Dawn demonstrates additional red flags. When interacting with Fred Hill in the initial days of the disappearance, Dawn focused disproportionately on Andy, asking whether Fred had seen Andy and what Andy had been doing. This is unusual behavior. A parent seeking a missing child typically asks about search progress, sightings, evidence, or police activity, not about one specific neighbor's whereabouts. The prioritization of Andy suggests either Dawn believed Andy possessed relevant knowledge, Dawn feared Andy's involvement would expose additional information, or Dawn was attempting to frame Andy as an external suspect to redirect early suspicion. All three possibilities carry investigative implications. The cluster also includes claims from law enforcement to Fred Hill that Dawn had outstanding illicit debts, and that investigators were exploring a scenario involving debt-linked abduction. Whether this theory was active or speculative, the detail introduces a potential motive for third-party involvement. More importantly, Dawn's own changing narratives often reflect themes consistent with underground networks such as trafficking, gang activity, shadow handlers, and rich buyers. These theories were often unprompted. Unprompted narrative inflation is considered a behavioral red flag, especially when the individual volunteers criminal scenarios that align with areas where they themselves have known associations. Dunn's overall reaction pattern displays avoidance, minimization, inconsistent emotion, and religious deflection. He frequently shifts toward religious language when confronted with emotionally or factually difficult questions. He avoids specifics, substitutes doctrine for personal reflection, or moves the conversation away from direct accountability. This creates an interpretive pattern of cognitive distancing. Furthermore, Dunn shows reluctance to assign punishment to any hypothetical offender. In one interview, when asked what should happen to the person who took or harmed Summer, Dunn answered, "I wouldn't wish prison on anyone." Innocent parents typically respond with a clear desire for justice or protection of their child. Dunn's avoidance here is notable both as an emotional mismatch and as a behavioral anomaly. The thematic thread connecting these anomalies is incongruent certainty combined with shifting narrative structures. Dunn's statements consistently reflect a belief that Summer is dead, knowledge or acceptance of her death, before law enforcement confirmed such a status, inconsistent spatial reconstruction of the disappearance, and repeated references to accident or vehicle-related harm that correlate with other family members' slips. When combined slippage, timeline contradictions, avoidance behaviors, religious deflection, and third-party allegations, Dunn's profile becomes highly irregular in a forensic sense. His statements span absolute certainty, unconscious self-placement at the scene, specific mechanisms of harm, and contradictions with other primary witnesses. The concentration of these anomalies places Dunn Wells within suspect class A in an analytical model based on inconsistency density, behavioral leakage, and alignment with unverified or suppressed information. Do Dunn Wells' repeated slips and contradictory reconstructions indicate suppressed knowledge of the event, or an internal narrative shaped by undisclosed involvement? The statements attributed to Candace Bly reveal a distinct pattern of linear, polished, and internally consistent narration that does not drift over time, even when months and years pass between retellings. This stability, while superficially appearing to demonstrate accuracy, instead presents a significant linguistic red flag: the absence of natural memory decay. In genuine recollections, especially those involving stressful or chaotic events, details tend to shift. Order becomes less precise. Minor aspects become blurred. Yet Candace's timeline remains rigidly identical across multiple interviews, multiple formats, and over extended time intervals. Such durability suggests rehearsal rather than authentic episodic recall. The most notable feature of Candace's account is its perfect alignment with the version provided by her mother, Grandis. Without deviation, both recount the same sequence: the ER visit, the medication pickup, the stop near the horse stables, the planting of the cactus, the peppermint candy, Summer asking to go inside, and the instruction to the boys to keep an eye on their sister. Over a full year of repeated questioning, neither Candace nor Grandis altered the structure, positioning, or micro details of this timeline. Memory science indicates that two independent witnesses rarely maintain identical phrasing and sequencing unless both are drawing from a shared script rather than independent recollection. The absence of corroboration for key structural components increases this concern. The ER visit is central to Candace's account, yet no publicly verified documentation, timestamp, or third-party witness has been confirmed within the dataset you provided. The same applies to the horse stable stop and the specific pharmacy timeline. Without independent verification, these components remain uncorroborated narrative elements. Their persistence in the script, despite lack of external validation, suggests an attempt to anchor the day's structure around controlled, unchallenged checkpoints. This is consistent with a staged narrative linear, tidy, insulated from external challenge, rather than a messy or evolving account grounded in uncontrolled observation. A critical contradiction emerges when comparing Candace's statement that Summer slept all day to the statements of Hunter, the last significant outside witness to see Summer alive before she returned to the Wells property. Hunter consistently reports that Summer was not asleep at critical moments, including the arrival and departure from his residence. He states Summer was alert, moving, and interacting normally. The conflict between slept all day and completely awake and eating a red popsicle is incompatible. One of these accounts is false. Given that Hunter's version contains spontaneous sensory details, such as the popsicle, and appears in an interview where he is not constructing a linear alibi, his version presents more indicators of veracity. Another essential piece of data appears in the form of a private emotional statement Candace made during a phone call. "I regret letting Summer play near that truck." This statement, made while distressed and not in a formal interview setting, contrasts sharply with the scripted timeline she later delivers. In behavioral analysis, unguarded statements made in emotional states tend to reflect authentic internal concerns or memories, whereas rehearsed accounts typically avoid incriminating detail or references to high-risk mechanisms of harm. In this case, the reference to a truck directly aligns with Don Wells's earlier slippage. "I thought she'd get run over." When two separate individuals produce thematically aligned statements about the same mechanism of harm, the probability of a shared cognitive event increases. Candace's behavior during media interactions also provides investigative value. Her decision to walk off the Dr. Phil set when the term cornbread mafia was mentioned demonstrates avoidance behavior triggered by the introduction of an external narrative she could not control. Genuine witnesses generally express confusion, curiosity, or fear when encountering unfamiliar allegations, not abrupt withdrawal. Early termination of a media engagement suggests a desire to avoid confrontation with material that contradicts or expands beyond the scripted timeline. Additional concerns emerge from allegations referenced across the files that Candace previously stated privately that she and Dawn were under some form of SA investigation, though this information is unverified. Even without formal confirmation, the existence of an alleged private admission indicates potential stressors within the home environment that may have influenced how the family managed or narrated the disappearance. While the allegation itself is not evidence, its presence in private conversation raises questions about the stability of Candace's public versus private narratives. Within Hunter's account, another anomaly emerges. Candace receives a message that appears to cause immediate distress or panic. Hunter describes a stark change in her demeanor after viewing the message. This observation introduces the possibility of an external trigger, whether a message from Dawn, a contact connected to the boyfriend of Grandis, or another individual entirely, that disrupted the controlled narrative she later presented. A sudden behavioral shift indicates the moment when the timeline became unstable or when new information intersected with actual events of the day. Candace's slippage also appears in her shifting description of where she last saw Summer. In different public contexts, she references the basement, the flower bed, the swing, the truck, or the general outdoor area. Each location carries different implications regarding access, opportunity, visibility, and the timeline of disappearance. Changes in last seen location are high-risk contradictions. When someone repeatedly recalibrates spatial information, it suggests either memory contamination or strategic repositioning to reduce exposure to scrutiny. Given the rigidity of the rest of her script, these location inconsistencies appear less like genuine confusion and more like attempts to manage which part of the property should be associated with the disappearance. Taken cumulatively, these elements create a profile of a controlled narrative designed to withstand scrutiny rather than evolve through natural recall. Candace's consistent sequencing, stable phrasing, and rehearsed alignment with Grandis's statement contrast sharply with the instability in peripheral details, such as the last seen location or the earlier emotional admission related to the truck. This dual-track pattern, rigid core narrative, with drifting outer details, often indicates that the central story has been repeatedly rehearsed, while ancillary components remain vulnerable to slippage because they have not been fully integrated into the script. Two investigative hypotheses emerge from this pattern. The first is a staged narrative hypothesis. Under this model, the key components of the day ER visit, planting flowers, peppermint candy, were arranged as a framework to justify time blocks that would otherwise require explanation. The insertion of the basement descent as the final event before disappearance provides a controlled narrative endpoint, one difficult to corroborate, and one that removes external witnesses from the timeline. The second hypothesis involves accident on the property followed by concealment. In this model, the consistent truck-related slippage, the stable alignment of Candace and Grandis's accounts, and the abrupt behavioral shifts would indicate an event that occurred unintentionally, potentially on or near a vehicle, followed by rapid narrative construction, intended to make the disappearance appear sudden and unsupervised. Both hypotheses remain conjectural without physical evidence. However, they emerge organically from the contradictions, omissions, and slippages present in Candace's statements. Her linguistic behavior, particularly the rigidity of her timeline, suggests maintenance of a narrative rather than expression of memory. The forensic value lies not in proving guilt, but in identifying discrepancies that challenge the credibility of the timeline and highlight the need for independent verification of each claimed event. Does Candace Bly's polished, unchanging narrative reflect genuine memory, or a rehearsed reconstruction designed to redirect scrutiny away from a high-risk event that occurred on the property? The data associated with Grandis positions her as a structurally significant yet strategically quiet figure within the Summer-Wells case. Her statements, historical background, and behavioral profile form a pattern distinct from both Dawn and Candace. Whereas Dawn demonstrates linguistic slippage and Candace displays narrative rigidity mixed with detail drift, Grandis presents a combination of controlled minimalism, selective cooperation, and complete script adherence. These features collectively position her as a high-relevant subject for forensic analysis, especially given her proximity to both the timeline and the individuals generating the primary narratives. The most immediately striking forensic detail is the existence of 5 to 10 aliases used by Grandis across different states, including Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Georgia. The aliases include variations of her birth name, married names, modified surnames, and at least one identity that appears unrelated to her legal or marital history. While the existence of multiple aliases does not inherently indicate criminal activity, it is uncommon and typically signals a history of instability, frequent relocation, legal entanglements, or attempts to compartmentalize prior records. When contextualized within a missing child investigation, the multiplicity of names elevates scrutiny because it complicates background checks, disrupts public record continuity, and obscures the accuracy of traceable historical information. The second major data point involves alleged child endangerment records in both Georgia and Wisconsin, which appear in the dataset without formal case documentation. Although unverified, the recurring nature of the allegations across 2 different states raises questions about pattern behaviors, prior household stability, and historical risk factors. More significant is the reference to a sealed domestic violence record, suggesting that at least one incident reached the level of official documentation. Sealed records, by nature, prevent access to the underlying details, but the existence of such a record indicates adjudicated involvement of sufficient severity for the court to restrict public visibility. In a forensic context, sealed records can either relate to victimization or perpetration. Without clarity, the only reliable conclusion is that Grandis has engaged with the legal system in ways not reflected in public statements. These background elements directly interface with her behavior during the Summer-Wells investigation. Grandis consistently delivers a perfectly linear, unchanging timeline that matches Candace's version with complete fidelity. Every detail: ER visit, medication pickup, stop at the stables, arrival home, planting the cactus, peppermint candy. Summer asking to go inside appears in the same sequence, with the same phrasing, across all retellings spanning over 1 year. There is no drift, no elaboration, no hesitation, and no natural variation. This level of narrative sameness between 2 separate individuals is highly atypical unless both are referencing a shared script. Memory does not remain static across time. Witnesses typically reorder events, omit non-essential details, or unintentionally alter sensory descriptions. The absence of change in Grandis's account suggests she is not recalling an event, but reciting a narrative designed to remain stable over time. This is reinforced by the fact that her story never expands even when prompted. Questions outside the core script are met with deflection, minimal responses, or simple reversion to the previously established sequence. Such behavior aligns with script adherence, a strategy used when a witness wishes to avoid introducing inconsistencies or revealing unplanned information. Grandis's lack of voluntary cooperation with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation adds another layer of concern. While she technically remains available, she has not initiated contact, provided updates, or attempted to clarify ambiguities in the timeline. This stands in contrast to her willingness to contact law enforcement when YouTubers approached her property, demonstrating that she is comfortable engaging police when she believes her boundaries are being crossed, but not when additional clarity regarding Summer's disappearance might be beneficial. This selective cooperation implies strategic engagement rather than full participation in the search for truth. Another significant forensic element is the case of Rosemary Bly, Grandis's daughter, who disappeared in 2009 while living in Wisconsin. Rosemary's car was found near a bar. She has never been located. The presence of two unsolved missing female cases within one nuclear family is statistically rare. Although correlation does not imply causation, investigators cannot dismiss the anomaly. In risk modeling, repeated extreme incidents within a single family system prompt deeper review of environmental factors, relational dynamics, and historical stressors that could intersect with both events. Even without direct connection, the coincidence amplifies the need for forensic scrutiny. Behaviorally, Grandis demonstrates a cold demeanor in all available footage and statements. Her tone remains detached, procedural, and devoid of effective markers consistent with distress, urgency, or grief. This does not necessarily indicate guilt or involvement, but it represents a mismatch between expected emotional behavior and observed presentation. Detachment can be a coping mechanism, a reflection of temperament, or a deliberate performance, but in forensic analysis, it functions as a data point to be interpreted alongside others, not in isolation. Grandis's strategic omission of unscripted content further reinforces the hypothesis of restricted narrative boundaries. She avoids elaboration on the following high-value investigative areas: the exact duration between returning home and lying down in the camper, who interacted with Summer after the planting of the cactus, sensory details about Summer's mood, clothing, or behavior, any loud noises, movements, or unusual activity during the critical window, any deviations from routine that day, the precise moment she last visually confirmed Summer's presence. Her refusal to engage in any detail outside the predetermined sequence suggests conscious restriction of information. Whether this restriction stems from fear, guilt, loyalty, or a desire to avoid conflict is beyond the scope of available evidence. However, the restriction is real and consistent. The combination of multiple aliases, prior alleged child-related cases, sealed records, a perfectly synchronized timeline with Candace, selective cooperation, emotional detachment, and the statistical anomaly of having two missing daughters produces a complex forensic profile. None of these elements alone would justify high suspicion. Together, however, they form a coherent behavioral pattern that cannot be ignored within a thorough analytical framework. Grandis operates as a silent stabilizer of the scripted narrative, maintaining uniformity, limiting variability, and ensuring the timeline remains intact regardless of external pressure. This makes her a crucial figure not because of what she reveals, but because of what she does not. The absence of natural memory drift, combined with avoidance of elaboration, is one of the clearest indicators of narrative rehearsal in the entire dataset. Does Grandis's rigid, unchanging account reflect truthful consistency, or a rehearsed narrative engineered to conceal knowledge of events that occurred during the critical window on June 15? In the reconstruction of June 15th, the only witness whose statements introduce new data, verifiable sensory detail, and internal consistency is Hunter. Unlike Candace and Grandis, whose timelines remain fixed and rehearsed, Hunter's account contains spontaneous recall, non-scripted descriptions, and contradiction testing details that align with observable evidence rather than narrative reinforcement. His statements challenge the controlled story constructed by Candace and Grandis, and they generate a version of events that is incompatible with the sleeping child narrative used to anchor the afternoon timeline. The most significant point is Hunter's insistence that Summer was not asleep in the truck at any point during the trip. According to Candace and Grandis, Summer slept almost the whole day, including in the truck between stops. But the contradiction is immediate. Hunter reports Summer was awake, alert, moving, and actively eating a red popsicle during their time at Allie's house. This popsicle detail appears nowhere in Candace's version. The specificity of the color and the context of the moment, Summer sitting upright, not dazed, not lethargic, serves as a sensory anchor. Sensory anchors are among the strongest indicators of truthful recall, particularly when the detail is irrelevant to self-protection or self-presentation. Hunter gains nothing by including the popsicle. Its presence in his account is an unmotivated detail, which increases credibility. This witness credibility is further strengthened by his description of 2 separate stops at Allie's residence, not one. Candace consistently maintains there was only a single stop. In contradiction analysis, the number of stops matters because it affects elapsed time, opportunities for observation, witness availability, and the plausibility of the pharmacy a home sequence. If Hunter is correct and his account is supported by Allie's household observations, the timeline presented by Candace is structurally false. A second stop extends the window and introduces additional verifiable witnesses, something Candace's fixed narrative avoids. At the pool, Hunter describes Candace drinking while supervising the children. Though the behavioral implications are not inherently criminal, they are relevant because Candace omits this entirely. Omission of a risk factor, even a socially unflattering one, is a known marker of narrative control. When a witness excludes behavior that others observed, and when that behavior influences decision-making, alertness, and reaction times, its omission becomes a contradiction with evidentiary weight. In the pool sequence, Hunter presents a version of the environment where distractions were present, energy levels differed from Candace's description, and interactions were more chaotic. This stands in contrast to Candace's smooth, linear portrayal of a calm day. Another anomaly appears when Hunter describes Candace receiving a message on her phone that created immediate distress. The change in her behavior was sufficient for Hunter to mark it as a pivot point in the day's tone. His commentary suggests that something in the message produced a cognitive or emotional disruption that was not explained to him. This single moment has investigative significance. It introduces the possibility of external pressure, emergent conflict, or a triggering instruction that shifted the direction of subsequent events. Candace does not acknowledge this message in her timeline, and Grandis's script has no reference to it. The absence of any mention from them reinforces the suspicion that this moment is incompatible with the controlled narrative. Across multiple interviews, Hunter demonstrates no motive to lie. He does not benefit from inserting himself into the story. There is no financial gain, no attempt to align with a particular theory, and no evidence of coercion or scripting. A panel of reviewers assessing verbal tone, micro-expressions, and narrative structure rated him as high truthfulness. His account contains hesitations typical of authentic recall, lacks rehearsed transitions, and displays natural memory drift in non-critical details. In contrast, scripted narratives maintain uniformity across retellings. Hunter's version shows the expected inconsistencies of genuine memory, changes in minor sequencing, but stability in core sensory facts. The milk jugs video becomes a critical piece of external evidence supporting Hunter's credibility. In Candace's version, Summer is asleep, yet the video shows her in a posture that many viewers interpret as uncomfortable or potentially unconscious. While the video is ambiguous, Hunter's description of Summer being awake earlier that day, eating, moving, and talking, establishes that Summer was not lethargic during the hours leading up to the return home. This reinforces the investigative interpretation that Summer's condition in the video represents a change that occurred after leaving the pool, not a continuation of prior sleepiness. Hunter's timeline also directly challenges the possibility that Summer died or was incapacitated before leaving the pool. His clear recollection of Summer standing near him, eating the popsicle, interacting, and moving independently at Allie's house establishes that Summer was alive, conscious, and functional after the swimming sequence. This eliminates several hypotheticals proposed in online speculation and establishes a grounded timeline. Summer's decline, if any, occurred after the events witnessed by Hunter. This is a crucial forensic boundary because it narrows the viable location and time of the incident. The contradictions between Candace and Hunter become most pronounced when examining the transition between locations. Hunter describes normal, alert behavior. Candace describes a sleepy, subdued child. The two descriptions are mutually exclusive. Without physical evidence supporting Candace's version, and without corroborative witnesses, the contradiction itself becomes a marker of deception or timeline alteration. Hunter's account aligns with natural child behavior following play and swimming. Candace's account aligns with narrative construction aimed at explaining a later condition. Additionally, the double-stop anomaly exposes a major structural flaw in Candace and Grandace's unified script. If there were indeed two stops at Allie's house, as Hunter states, then the timeline in Candace's ER Stables pharmacy sequence becomes severely compressed. A compressed timeline is a hallmark of constructed narratives, where events are fit into reduced intervals to eliminate exposure to contradictory witnesses or unplanned variables. Hunter's account increases the number of observable events, thereby expanding the timeline into a form that is less compatible with the narrow, rehearsed version provided by Candace and Grandace. The fact that Hunter never attempts to direct blame toward any specific individual further solidifies his status as a high-integrity witness. He does not speculate. He does not infer motives. He confines himself to first-hand experience. Such restraint increases the forensic weight of his statements because it demonstrates separation between observation and interpretation, a key marker of truthful recollection. From an investigative standpoint, Hunter's account serves two primary functions. It establishes a verifiable timeline for the morning and early afternoon of June 15. His details about Summer's condition, the popsicle, the double stop, and the behavioral dynamics at the pool reconstruct the last proven observations of Summer in a way that does not rely on Candace or Grandace. It eliminates the possibility that Summer died or lost consciousness before leaving the pool or before arriving at home. This restriction forces the investigative focus onto the Wells property after the drop-off and before the 9/11 call. Without Hunter's testimony, the timeline presented by Candace and Grandace would stand unchallenged. With his testimony, the central narrative collapses. His account does not merely disagree with theirs, it makes their version physically impossible. The moment one witness places Summer awake, eating, talking, and moving at the same time another claims she is sleeping all day, the contradiction invalidates the controlled timeline. Does Hunter's consistent, sensory-specific testimony reconstruct the last truthful version of events? And does its conflict with the Candace-Grandace script reveal the precise window where the real timeline was replaced? In the broader reconstruction of June 15th, the data surrounding Jody Sue Brown does not form a straightforward narrative. Instead, it presents a mixture of contradictory timestamps, selective disclosures, and statements that appear to shift depending on audience, platform, or the passage of time. While her proximity to the Wells property and her claim of having a continuous observational vantage point should, theoretically, make her a high-value witness, the inconsistencies in her statements complicate her role and introduce the possibility of obstruction, either intentional or through narrative contamination. The most structurally significant component involves two temporal claims that cannot coexist. In several recountings, Jody Sue states that Summer was gone at 3:20 p.m. This time reference implies awareness of the moment Summer disappeared or of specific activity occurring at or before that time. However, Jody Sue has also repeatedly stated that she heard a scream at around 5:30 p.m. If both statements are treated as literal, they cancel each other out. A disappearance known at 3:20 eliminates the possibility of a meaningful scream at 5:30. Conversely, a scream at 5:30 indicates a potential event long after the earlier timestamp of gone. These time conflicts do not appear as minor memory drift. They represent a 2-hour discrepancy between two alleged high-salience events. High-salience events, such as hearing a scream or witnessing the disappearance of a child, typically produce stable recall anchors. When an individual consistently shifts anchors of this magnitude across multiple years, it raises questions about whether the information is based on direct observation or retroactive reconstruction. A second point of concern is Jody Sue's decision to deny access to her property for search efforts on June 15th. Of all individuals within the immediate perimeter, she was the only one who refused. The refusal itself is not illegal, but its timing is critical. The first hours after a child's disappearance are characterized by rapid mobilization of search resources, and law enforcement emphasizes expanding the perimeter quickly. When a neighbor located directly along the access route declines search permission, investigators must rely on exterior observation rather than comprehensive examination. This creates a blind spot, however small, within the operational grid. The rationale Jody Sue provided for the refusal has not remained stable across the years. At times, she attributes it to personal boundaries. In other instances, she presents logistical or safety concerns. The inconsistency in justification mirrors the inconsistency in the timeline. Behaviors linked to refusal during an emergency event carry forensic relevance because they may signal avoidance, concealment, or an unwillingness to allow independent verification of stated observations. Another pattern arises in Jody Sue's shifting recounting of the hours leading up to the 9:11 call. While she often describes herself as having continuous auditory monitoring of the hollows and ridge lines, the specifics of what she heard change depending on context. She has described faint noises, loud human-like screams, sudden silence, or background activity, but without consistent anchors or corroboration from others. No independent witness within the vicinity confirmed hearing the same scream at 5:30 p.m., creating an isolated data point that lacks external support. From a forensic standpoint, isolated sensory claims require careful evaluation. When a witness is the sole source of a sound-based observation that carries potential case significance, investigators must assess whether the memory is genuine, misattributed, contaminated by later information, or influenced by internal biases. In Jody Sue's case, the variability across recounting suggests that the scream may be a product of retroactive narrative shaping rather than real-time perception. The issue extends further when examining statements from her daughter, who reported that Andy saw Summer's body. The origin and validity of this statement is uncertain, but its existence within the household's discourse suggests that sensitive or investigative relevant information circulated through the family independent of law enforcement channels. If the daughter's statement was derived from witnessing an actual conversation between Jody Sue and Andy, or if it reflects overheard information, it raises the question of why such a claim was never reported formally. If it is instead a manufactured claim, its presence still reflects instability in the household's narrative environment. Jody Sue's proximity to Fields Road, which later drew the attention of law enforcement, introduces another layer of investigative interest. Fields Road presents a network of connecting routes, blind curves, and access points to wooded terrain. If law enforcement repeatedly revisited the area surrounding Fields Road, their interest suggests the possibility of movement or activity during the early search window. Jody Sue's home location, her line of sight, and her stated observations intersect directly with this terrain. Yet her accounts do not provide consistent or actionable insight into that space. Instead, they cycle between generalities and contradictory claims, offering no stable data points for investigators to map. Her broader communication pattern reflects a notable trend: statements that expand, retract, or shift focus over time. In early accounts, she emphasizes certain details. In later accounts, she adds new components or reframes earlier ones. This type of narrative drift is not equivalent to natural memory decay. Natural decay results in minor omissions, not fundamental contradictions. The repeated reshaping of her story suggests the influence of external information sources, online theory diffusion, community speculation, or social media engagement. Narrative convergence with online content is a recognized form of contamination, where a witness unconsciously blends personal recollection with post-event information. In forensic interviewing, consistency across repeated retellings is rarely the sole measure of credibility. Investigators also analyze whether the structure of the narrative aligns with real-world constraints: time, distance, acoustics, visibility, and documented activity. Jody Sue's time claims do not map cleanly onto the known movements on Ben Hill Road. Her auditory claims do not align with environmental conditions or corroborative testimony. Her refusal to permit early search access does not match expected cooperative behavior during a missing child emergency. Furthermore, her claims to have observed or heard specific things through windows or across terrain require scrutiny regarding physical plausibility. The topography of Ben Hill includes tree lines, dips, ridges, and obstructive foliage. The idea that she maintained real-time awareness of the movements of specific individuals or vehicles is difficult to reconcile with environmental constraints. Another important aspect is her public behavior. Jody Sue has engaged extensively in online commentary, live streaming her interpretations of the case and her impressions of events. High-output commentary environments increase the risk of narrative drift, as repeated speaking often leads individuals to fill gaps, extrapolate, or rewrite memory unintentionally. This phenomenon is well documented in witness psychology. Repetition increases confidence, not accuracy. When a witness publicly reframes events, it becomes increasingly difficult for investigators to determine which version, if any, reflects original perception. The cumulative effect of these patterns, contradictory timestamps, refusal of search access, shifting explanations, isolated sensory claims, exposure to information contamination, and proximity to an area of investigative interest positions Jody Sue not as a reliable source of timeline reconstruction, but as a potential contributor to obstruction. Obstruction, in this context, does not necessarily imply intentional concealment of a crime. It may reflect the creation of noise that obscures the investigative signal, making it harder for authorities to distinguish between actionable information and narrative pollution. From an analytical perspective, the significance of Jody Sue's involvement lies not in what she provides, but in what she destabilizes. Her statements complicate the timeline rather than clarify it. They introduce contradictions rather than remove them. They generate false anchors that must be disentangled from the event structure. Whether her actions arise from personal motives, misunderstandings, or deliberate obfuscation is undetermined based on the available data. Are Jody Sue Brown's shifting claims and contradictory timestamps accidental distortions, or deliberate contributions to a narrative environment that obscures the true sequence of events on June 15th? The investigative relevance of the Van Hill corridor emerges not from speculation, but from structural patterns. The geography accommodates discrete movement. The area lacks comprehensive surveillance coverage. It carries a historical association with illicit underground activity, and the 2024 TBI raid represents the first major enforcement action there since Summer Wells disappeared. When these elements intersect with existing statements, including the police assertion, reported by Fred Hill, that Dawn owes an illicit debt, they create a coherent framework for analyzing whether the disappearance involved movement through this corridor and whether individuals familiar with the terrain leveraged it to facilitate transport or concealment. The TBI raid on 3500 Van Hill in 2024 is the most concrete external indicator that the area holds investigative significance beyond what was originally assumed in 2022. The raid, substantially larger in scope than prior enforcement actions, targeted a property outside the initial search grids. This fact alone signals reevaluation by law enforcement of earlier assumptions about where Summer could have been taken or hidden. When an area receives significant attention after years of inactivity, it usually reflects new intelligence, corroboration of earlier informal claims, or re-examination of unexplored corridors relevant to movement logistics. Van Hill's topography is critical to its forensic value. The area contains a network of ravines, unmaintained logging trails, ponds, and secondary roads with no camera coverage. These geographic features provide natural concealment and easy access points for vehicles capable of off-road or semi-off-road travel. The absence of surveillance infrastructure reduces detection probability for vehicles moving in and out of the corridor. This makes Van Hill a viable location for a concealment operation or a temporary staging area. In cases involving movement after an incident, unsupervised corridors with multiple entry points are statistically more likely to host either transfer events or early disposal attempts. The area's logistical characteristics align with the reported police statement that Dawn owes an illicit debt. If early investigators considered the possibility of retaliation or a collection mechanism connected to that debt, Van Hill becomes a plausible route. Enforcement tied to underground networks often involves moving individuals away from the residence towards secluded spaces controlled or familiar to the participants. Ravines, abandoned trails, and properties with limited supervision provide opportunities for rapid transfer without exposure to public view. This is consistent with the Katy 9 scent trail stopping abruptly at the roadway near the Wells property, which indicates that Summers' scent did not continue on foot, but was likely intercepted by a vehicle. A scent termination at a roadway without continuation is a strong indicator of vehicle pickup. It does not confirm who was involved, but it does establish that movement by foot was not the primary transport method. This supports a model where the child was loaded into a vehicle shortly after leaving the immediate perimeter. When the endpoint of a scent aligns with a road connected to a low surveillance corridor, the probability of transportation increases. Within the dataset you provided, there is reference to an unverified red Toyota Tacoma. While no confirmed evidence links this vehicle to the disappearance, the Tacoma is relevant because it fits the profile of a truck capable of navigating rough or unimproved routes. Many of the logging trails on Van Hill require higher ground clearance. Although the Tacoma detail remains unconfirmed, it remains a part of the narrative environment due to its potential compatibility with Van Hill's terrain. The map produced by Donna, though not evidentiary in a traditional sense, gains analytical interest because it aligns geographically with Fred Hill's local knowledge of ravines, confluences, and transitional zones. When independent sources, even unconventional ones, describe overlapping locations, the resulting convergence increases investigative interest. Convergence does not prove accuracy, but it narrows the spatial window for further analysis. The possibility of transport from Ben Hill Road to Van Hill Road requires local familiarity. These areas are not intuitive to navigate without prior exposure. Many of the side trails, especially those leading into deep hollows, are unmarked or unofficial. Navigation requires awareness of which branches lead to dead ends, which loops connect to other ridges, and which paths remain passable under different weather conditions. Local individuals, especially those with ties to illicit networks or logging activity, develop such knowledge through repeated use. This supports the hypothesis that if transport occurred, it likely involved someone with established familiarity rather than a stranger. The movement model under consideration involves 3 phases: extraction from the Wells property, transport to a corridor with limited visibility, concealment, temporary or permanent, within terrain that complicates recovery. The extraction phase aligns with the K9 trail ending at the roadway. The transport phase aligns with Van Hill's accessibility and the red Tacoma narrative. The concealment phase aligns with the presence of ravines, ponds, and logging trails. The 2024 TBI action indicates that law enforcement revisited these phases. A multi-agency raid of this scale in a rural area 4 years after the disappearance suggests that new intelligence pointed to Van Hill as a potential staging or concealment location. Law enforcement agencies do not reallocate resources without cause. The raid may signal that information collected from interviews, informants, or unrelated cases pointed to Van Hill activity during or after June 15, 2021. Illicit networks are relevant, not because they directly implicate specific individuals, but because their operational characteristics increase the likelihood of movement to off-grid areas. Illicit networks utilize rural corridors with low surveillance to avoid detection. They often rely on vehicles that can traverse mixed terrain routes. If Dawn had unresolved financial entanglements with individuals connected to such networks, as stated in the police information relayed to Fred, the possibility arises that the disappearance intersects with debt enforcement patterns. Debt enforcement in illicit economies frequently involves removal from the point of conflict, movement to a secondary location, and concealment until leverage is established. If a child were taken as leverage or retaliation, The corridor's geographic features would be advantageous. The absence of reliable camera coverage increases the likelihood of undetected movement. The physical landscape reduces the probability of discovery, even by trained personnel. The fact that Van Hill was not included in the original 2021-2022 search grids increases its relevance. Search operations in missing child cases typically focus on areas within known movement range, proximity to the last seen location, and zones accessible by foot. Van Hill's more complex trail system and its separation from primary roads may have contributed to its omission. The lack of early search activity also makes the corridor a viable candidate for initial disposal operations that remained undisturbed. The alignment between Donna's map and Fred's knowledge, while not proof, adds weight to the corridor's relevance. Fred's local familiarity with hollows, confluences, and water-adjacent terrain mirrors the features highlighted. This convergence suggests that the corridor fits the parameters of a location where movement would be both feasible and concealed. The investigative value of this cluster lies in its structural coherence. Each component, KD9 trail termination, unsearched terrain, absence of surveillance, local, only navigability, and a significant 2024 raid, supports a model in which transportation and concealment overlapped with geographically advantageous areas. While no single piece of information proves that Van Hill played a direct role, the combination of terrain, lack of early search, and later law enforcement attention elevates it within the analytical framework. The corridor becomes a critical zone, not because of speculation, but because it provides the most logistically plausible route for undetected movement between the Wells property and an isolated environment. The central forensic question becomes, does the intersection of debt, related statements, KD9 scent termination, navigable terrain, and a later TBI raid indicate that Van Hill functioned as the transport and concealment corridor in the earliest hours of the disappearance? The dataset surrounding Summer Wells' disappearance contains a small, but unusually consequential group of peripheral individuals whose statements, proximity, or behaviors intersect with the earliest hours of the search. These individuals, Roy Cotton, Doug Gott, and John Smith, do not fit into the primary suspect categories, nor do they appear in law enforcement's public briefings. Yet they collectively form what can be described as a death cluster, a pattern in which individuals tied to the initial search radius, or early knowledge, appear to have died in the months following the event. While no evidence confirms foul play in their deaths, the pattern raises forensic questions about witness vulnerability, unrecorded knowledge, and whether these individuals held fragments of information about the disappearance. The first notable figure is Roy Cotton, whose statement, "When they find Summer, they will know who did it," stands out for its implicit certainty. The phrasing suggests that Roy believed two things simultaneously: that Summer would eventually be found, and that her discovery would directly implicate a specific individual or group. This is not speculative language. It indicates perceived knowledge of a causative link between Summer's recovery and the exposure of a responsible party. Forensic interpretation of such statements typically focuses on whether the speaker is conveying first-hand information, repeating community speculation, or engaging in narrative embellishment. In Roy's case, the precision of his phrasing aligns more closely with the first category. He did not say, "They might know," or "He might point to someone." He used a deterministic structure, "when not if," and "they will know," not "they might suspect." The combination creates a statement with investigative significance, especially because Roy is no longer available for follow-up questioning. The relevance of Roy's death lies not in its cause, but in its timing. Losing a potential witness eliminates the opportunity for law enforcement to test the origin of his claim, determine whether he observed something directly, or assess whether his knowledge derived from conversations with individuals involved in the case. His statement exists in isolation now, uncontextualized and unverifiable. That isolation reduces its evidentiary value, but increases its investigative weight because it can no longer be examined against other accounts. The second individual, Doug Gott, enters the dataset primarily through association. Donna's descriptions, though unconventional, match locals' references to Doug as a physically distinctive figure. often described with a hunchback characteristic. While Donna's contributions are not evidentiary, the match between her description and a known individual suggests that she may have perceived, overheard, or been exposed to local information that later emerged in her symbolic descriptions. Doug's proximity to the hollow and his presence within the small cluster of people nearby place him in a position where he could have observed vehicle movement, human activity, or unusual interactions on the day of the disappearance. However, like Roy, Doug is deceased. His death eliminates another vector of potential information. What makes Doug's case notable from an analytical standpoint is that he is not simply a peripheral figure. He is associated with a physical description that appears in multiple independent accounts and community discussions. Losing a person whose identity corresponds to an early and repeated description removes the possibility of clarifying whether he had knowledge of movement along the ridge, whether he encountered individuals on foot or in vehicles, or whether he possessed information about the direction someone traveled immediately after the disappearance. The third figure, John Smith, intersects with the timeline through his documented interaction with Fred Hill on June 15th. John's presence near the barn on the evening of the disappearance places him within the relevant search radius. Any individual who was physically present near convergence points, hollows, trails, roadway transitions on the evening of June 15 holds potential investigative value. John's interaction with Fred, which was part of the informal search, could have exposed him to statements, observations, or suspicions exchanged among locals while the search was still unstructured. Early impressions, before narrative solidified, are often the most accurate because they occur before external contamination or online speculation influence witness memory. Yet John also died before his account could be fully documented or analyzed in depth. The death cluster pattern becomes more analytically significant when viewed collectively. One death may be coincidence. Two deaths, within a narrow group tied to the same geographic and temporal perimeter, become notable. Three deaths within the group of individuals connected to the hollow, the barn, and early evening movements constitute a pattern worth examining probabilistically. In a small rural population, the death of multiple individuals within a shared case context creates investigative noise, but also raises the possibility that law enforcement inadvertently lost multiple witnesses capable of filling gaps in the logistical map of June 15. It is important to clarify the dataset you provided includes no evidence of foul play in these deaths. This analysis does not assert causation. Rather, it identifies that key individuals, each with potential contextual information, are no longer available, and this absence impacts the investigative landscape. In missing person cases, cluster loss of peripheral witnesses reduces triangulation ability. Without triangulation, law enforcement must rely more heavily on primary witnesses whose statements may contain fabrication, rehearsal, or suppression. Another dimension of this pattern is the narrative environment surrounding these individuals. Peripheral actors often occupy a unique position in rural cases. They are not part of the central family unit, nor part of law enforcement, but they are embedded in the local environment where informal knowledge circulates. People in such positions often hear statements, observe vehicle patterns, or notice activity that outsiders cannot. When a cluster of these individuals dies, the loss extends beyond biography. It represents a loss of local intelligence. The link between the death cluster and the concept of a handover, the idea that Summer was moved or transferred between vehicles or individuals, arises from the adjacency of these individuals to the hollow and barn area. These locations are relevant because they sit along potential movement corridors connecting Ben Hill to other ridges and roadways. If any early transfer occurred, especially involving a vehicle pickup, those in proximity to the barn or ridgeline might have noticed unusual acceleration, dust plumes, engine sounds, lights, or unfamiliar vehicles. Their loss removes possible confirmation of whether the transfer hypothesis holds situational credibility. Peripheral actors also have investigative value when they possess indirect knowledge. Statements like Roy Cotton's suggest indirect or secondhand awareness of something significant. If his statement derived from conversations with individuals involved or with people who witnessed a part of the sequence, The chain of information is now irretrievable. Doug's match with Donna's descriptions presents another form of indirect alignment, a physical descriptor repeated across sources. John's presence on the day of disappearance provides proximity-based relevance. The removal of each of these figures creates a void in the mosaic of early information. One forensic question concerns why only individuals connected to the early search appear in this death cluster. While this may be coincidence, the pattern is structurally unusual. The early search participants possess a unique characteristic. They operated before formal narratives hardened. They were working from immediate sensory conditions, not from mediated or filtered accounts. Individuals in this category often recall details that were not yet shaped by others' information. Their early observations, had they survived to be interviewed more comprehensively, may have revealed inconsistencies in other accounts or directed attention to overlooked pathways. An additional consideration is that individuals at the periphery often serve as informal validators. They either confirm or contradict accounts from the central family or from neighbors. When they die, the remaining narrative weight shifts disproportionately toward the individual still alive, regardless of their reliability. This dynamic can inadvertently elevate deceptive or incomplete narratives simply because contradictory voices are no longer present. From a forensic perspective, the peripheral deaths do not implicate these individuals as offenders. Rather, the pattern elevates them as lost witnesses, people whose absence reduces visibility into the event structure. Their deaths do not clarify the case, they obscure it. The core investigative value of this cluster lies in what it signals. Each individual had potential access to early, unfiltered information. Their deaths eliminate the ability to test the transfer or movement hypotheses. The pattern of deaths raises questions about the fragility of early witness networks. Does the disappearance of every peripheral observer near the hollow and barn reflect coincidence? Or the systematic loss of individuals who could have confirmed a movement event during the earliest hours of June 15th? The Summer Wells case demonstrates how quickly an investigation can lose structural integrity when early evidence is unstable, witness statements diverge, and initial response conditions are not tightly controlled. The first lesson is the critical need for immediate preservation of independent witnesses. When individuals who hold peripheral but potentially valuable information disappear, refuse cooperation, or die, the investigative matrix collapses into a small set of narratives that may be incomplete or deceptive. A second lesson is the necessity of rapid verification of claimed timelines. Unverified stops, undocumented movements, and unchallenged alibis create long-term ambiguity that becomes nearly impossible to resolve once memory decay sets in. Third, the case highlights the danger of narrative contamination. Public speculation, social media commentary, and rehearsed statements can overwhelm unfiltered ground-level observations, causing investigators to work backwards through layers of distortions rather than forward from facts. Finally, the case underscores the importance of search, grid completeness. Areas dismissed early, such as Van Hill, can later emerge as significant, forcing investigators to reallocate resources years after the optimal window has closed. Overall, the case reveals how fragile the investigative structure becomes when the first 48 hours are shaped more by contradiction and confusion than by verifiable data.